Imagine the most heavily defended port on the planet. Singapore Harbour, September 1943. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. Patrol boats slicing the dark water in overlapping grids. Searchlights that turn night into noon every 90 seconds. Steel torpedo nets strung beneath the surface like fishing wire on a grand scale. Japanese Imperial Navy warships moored 3 deep at the docks, and a garrison of 40,000 soldiers sleeping within earshot of the water dot. Now imagine 6 rubber canoes, each one roughly the size of a dining table, slipping through that net of light and steel without a single engine. 6 canoes paddled by hand. 6 canoes crewed by 12 men. 12 men in dark clothing, faces blackened with grease, breathing through their noses because even the sound of open-mouth breathing was too loud. 12 men who had traveled over 4,000 kilometers by sea to reach this exact patch of water. 12 men who, by every known law of military logic, physics, and basic human self-preservation, had no business being there, dot. And they were not there to observe. They were not there to photograph. They were not there to gather intelligence and slip away like ghosts. They were there to blow up the Japanese Navy's shipping fleet from the inside of the harbor, by hand, one limpet mine at a time, attached to steel hulls by touch in the pitch dark, while enemy sentries paced the docks 6 meters above their heads, dot. The Japanese Imperial Navy did not know they were there. They would not know for months. And when they finally understood what had happened inside their most fortified port in the Pacific, the answer they arrived at made absolutely no sense. Because the answer was that 14 Australians had sailed an old fishing boat through 6,000 kilometers of enemy-controlled ocean, paddled into the heart of their empire in canvas canoes, and blown 7 of their ships to pieces before quietly paddling away. To understand how insane this mission was, you need to understand what the Japanese Empire had built in the Pacific by 1943. Not just an army, not just a fleet. An empire of water, a maritime fortress stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the oil fields of Borneo in the south, from the beaches of Burma in the west to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific in the east. An area larger than the continental United States, controlled not by walls or fences, but by the absolute dominance of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In February of 1942, the Japanese had done something that the British Empire considered physically impossible. They had taken Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, the most fortified port in Asia, the crown jewel of British power in the Pacific, and they had taken it in 70 days. With bicycles, the Japanese infantry had cycled down the Malay Peninsula through jungle the British generals swore was impenetrable, arrived at the back door of the great fortress, and knocked politely with artillery until 85,000 Allied soldiers, the largest capitulation in British military history, walked out with their hands up. 85,000 men, gone. And among them were 15,000 Australians, fathers, brothers, sons from Brisbane and Melbourne and Perth, who would spend the next 3.5 years in conditions so brutal that 1 in 3 would not survive to see the end of the war. The fall of Singapore was not just a military defeat. For Australia, it was a national trauma so deep it rewired the country's relationship with the concept of British protection forever. The empire that was supposed to keep them safe had not just failed, it had collapsed. And the men in the cages were paying the price. By mid-1942, Japan controlled every major port, shipping lane, and supply route between India and New Guinea. The Pacific was their lake. Their merchant shipping moved freely, feeding the empire's insatiable appetite for oil, rubber, and steel. Sinking those ships was the only way to starve the machine. But the ships were guarded. The ports were fortified. The airspace was patrolled. Conventional naval assault was measured in destroyers and carriers and blood by the bucketful. What was needed was something else entirely. Something small, something invisible, something so audacious that the enemy would not consider it possible until the fires were already burning. Lieutenant Commander Ivan Lyon was 30 years old, British Army, a man whose career file read like a pulp novel written by someone who had run out of plausible events. He had escaped Singapore on a junk, traditional wooden sailing vessel 3 days before the city fell, navigated 1,500 kilometers of Japanese patrolled water, arrived in Sumatra, helped organize the evacuation of hundreds of civilian refugees, was shipwrecked twice, and eventually turned up in Ceylon looking like something the Indian Ocean had discarded. He had then, upon arriving safely, immediately begun planning to go back. Lion was not a man who processed danger the way most people do. He processed it as information, useful, actionable, something to be factored into a plan and worked around. His colleagues described him as frighteningly calm. His commanding officers described him as brilliant and almost certainly going to get himself killed on purpose. The British Army, not knowing what else to do with him, quietly assigned him to Special Operations Executive and told him to go be extraordinary somewhere that wouldn't embarrass the Crown too publicly. 14 men in total. 14 volunteers. Not volunteers in the sense that their names were drawn from a hat of reluctant conscripts. Volunteers in the sense that they had read the briefing document describing the mission, absorbed the sections that used phrases like no possibility of extraction, extremely high risk of total loss, and Japanese treatment of captured Special Forces operatives, and had then put their hands up anyway. Some had smiled while they did it. That detail appears in multiple accounts. There was something wrong with all of them in exactly the right way, and their vehicle, their ship, their steed, their weapon, their home for the next several weeks, was a 60-foot Japanese fishing vessel called the Crate, named after the small, intensely venomous snake common to the region. An animal that would kill you before you even registered it had moved. She was old, she smelled of fish oil and diesel, and every British officer who saw her asked why we were sailing a garbage scow into enemy waters. That was exactly the point. The plan, when Lion first presented it to Allied Command in 1943, was not rejected because it was too dangerous. It was rejected because it was too audacious. There is a difference. Too dangerous means the casualties are unacceptable. Too audacious means the planners cannot process the concept at all. The proposal called for a handful of men to sail a disguised enemy fishing vessel through 6,000 kilometers of Japanese-controlled water, penetrate Singapore Harbour, the most fortified port in the Pacific, attach explosive devices to the hulls of Japanese ships, and then sail home, alone, without support, without any form of air cover, naval backup, or extraction option if anything went wrong. The Allied commanders who reviewed the plan used several words to describe it. Suicidal appears in at least 3 separate documents. Fantastical appears in 2. One British Rear Admiral reportedly read the briefing document, put it down, and asked whether it was some kind of joke. It was not. Lion had done his homework. The Crate was small enough and generic-looking enough to pass as local fishing traffic at a distance. The Malay Peninsula and Indonesian archipelago were full of such vessels, and Japanese patrols concentrated on Allied warships, not local fishing craft. The limpet mines his team would use were magnetic, waterproof, and fitted with time delay fuses that could be set to detonate hours after the canoes had cleared the harbour. If the timing worked, the men would be long gone before the first explosion ripped through a hull. The plan was approved in June of 1943. The Crate departed from Exmouth Gulf in Western Australia on the 2nd of September. 14 men, provisions for 60 days, enough explosive to ruin someone's war, and a cover identity so thin it would not survive a serious inspection. They were disguised as local fishermen, or rather, as disguised as 14 Caucasian men can be in waters where every local fishing crew was Malay, Indonesian, or Japanese. They dyed their skin with a chemical solution that turned it a dark brown. They wore local clothing, they adopted local mannerisms, and they prayed, each in his own way, that no Japanese patrol boat got close enough to notice that their fishermen had European bone structure and spoke not a word of Malay between them. The probability of being stopped and boarded at some point in the next 6,000 kilometers was not negligible. It was a near certainty, and if they were boarded, if a Japanese officer stepped onto the deck of the Crate and asked for documentation, crew manifests, catch records, the mission would end in the only way available, badly. The first 3 weeks at sea were an education in what sustained, grinding, all-pervasive fear does to the human body over time. Not the sharp, electric fear of immediate danger. That kind of fear your body knows how to handle, flooding you with adrenaline and narrowing your focus to a pinpoint. This was the other kind, the slow background radiation kind of fear that saturates everything, the kind that makes the food taste like cardboard and the sleep come in thin, unsatisfying slivers, and every sound on the water, every creak of the hull, every distant engine note, every change in the pattern of the waves, arrive like a telegram from the universe that might say everything is fine, or might say your mission ends. Here, Japanese aircraft passed overhead 17 times during the voyage north. 17 times, the men on deck performed their fisherman's pantomime, adjusting nets, examining catch, going about the unhurried business of men who had nothing to hide and nowhere particular to be. 17 times, the aircraft banked away and continued on its patrol route. 17 times, the men below decks unclenched their hands and breathed. Japanese patrol vessels passed at close range on 4 separate occasions. The closest was a destroyer, a full naval warship, bristling with guns and crew, that passed within 800 meters of the crate in the late afternoon light. The destroyer was close enough that the Z Special Unit operators could see the silhouettes of Japanese sailors on deck, could see them going about their duties, looking at the horizon, looking at the water, looking at everything in the world except the scruffy fishing boat that was steadily, methodically, incrementally going somewhere that fishing boats had absolutely no business going. The destroyer did not stop. The destroyer did not hail them. The destroyer continued on its way, carrying with it absolutely no idea that the men it had just ignored were carrying enough high explosive to sink it 3 times over. By mid-September, the crate had navigated through the Lombok Strait, a narrow current swept passage between Bali and Lombok Islands that served as a major Japanese naval corridor, and was moving north-northwest through the Java Sea toward the Riau Archipelago, the island cluster south of Singapore Harbour. They had covered 4,000 kilometers. They were in the outermost approaches to the most defended port in the Pacific, and the real problem was just beginning. Because the crate could not go any further, the harbour approaches were too shallow, too well patrolled, too dangerously exposed for a 60-foot vessel to penetrate without generating exactly the kind of attention that meant instant death. The last stage of the journey, the stage that mattered, the stage that the entire mission existed to accomplish, had to be done differently, had to be done quietly, had to be done in the dark, by hand, across 15 kilometers of open water, in full-boats, collapsible canvas canoes barely 50 centimeters wide, carrying mines, food, weapons, and nothing else. The blokes looked at the canoes, then they looked at Singapore. Then they said right then and started loading the mines. On the night of the 24th of September 1943, 3 two-man canoe teams slipped off the side of the crate into black water and began paddling north towards Singapore. Lyon and Able Seaman Huston in Canoe 1. Lieutenant Davidson and Able Seaman Falls in Canoe 2. Corporal Crilly and Able Seaman Whiting in Canoe 3. 6 men. 3 canoes. Each canoe loaded with limpet mines, rations for 3 days, a compass, paddles, and the absolute minimum equipment required to survive long enough to do the job. The crate turned and motored quietly away into the dark to wait at a pre-arranged rendezvous point. If the canoe teams were not at that point within a certain window of time, the crate would leave without them. This was not cruelty. This was mathematics. A 60-foot vessel sitting stationary in Japanese patrolled waters for too long was a 60-foot vessel that would be found. And a vessel that was found meant dead men, failed mission, blown cover, and the Japanese Imperial Navy given advance warning of the entire concept of small craft harbor raids. The standing order was unambiguous. You miss the window, you find your own way home. Through 6,000 kilometers of enemy ocean. The paddle to Singapore took 3 nights of moving in absolute silence across water that Japanese patrol boats owned entirely. The canoes hugged the shadows of small islands, waited out the patrol boat sweeps pressed flat against rocky shorelines, navigated by stars and compass bearing and the distant blaze of Singapore's city lights reflecting off the cloud base ahead of them. They ate cold rations, drank sparingly from canteens, and spoke to each other only when they had to, in whispers so low they were barely vibration in the air. On the second night, they nearly ended the war for themselves. A Japanese patrol launch swept a searchlight across the water barely 200 meters from where Lyon's canoe was motionless against a mangrove bank. Both men holding their paddles still, breathing shallowly, watching the oval of light slide across the surface toward them. The light swept over the water 3 meters to their left. 3 meters, the width of a small room. Then it moved on. The launch continued. The men waited for 5 full minutes before they allowed themselves to exhale properly. By the third night, the canoes were in the outer approaches of Keppel Harbour, the main commercial port attached to Singapore, where Japanese merchant shipping docked in dense, crowded rows. The harbour lights were reflected in the water around them. The silhouettes of ships rose in every direction, their superstructures blotting out sections of the night sky. Somewhere on those docks, Japanese sentries were walking their beats, checking the time, thinking about their next meal, utterly unaware that 3 tiny canvas boats were threading between the anchor chains of the ships they were guarding. And in those boats, in the darkness between the hulls, 12 hands reached out and began attaching magnets to steel. A limpet mine is a beautiful piece of engineering in the way that a scalpel is beautiful. Not because it looks good, but because it does exactly one thing with absolute precision. A disc of high explosive approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, fitted on one face with a cluster of powerful horseshoe magnets that adhere instantly and irresistibly to any ferrous metal surface. A time delay fuse, preset, gives you a window. Attach it to a ship's hull at the waterline, set the fuse, and the explosion happens below the waterline where the ship is thinnest, and the consequences are most catastrophic. The water itself amplifies the blast, channeling it through the hull in a focus column that no amount of structural steel can withstand from the inside. What the limpet mine requires is closeness. You cannot throw it. You cannot fire it. You have to place it. By hand. On the hull of the ship, while sitting in a canvas boat, in the dark, beside the ship you are about to destroy. While the crew sleeps 6 meters above your head, Leon's team attached their first mine at 11:47 p.m. The magnetic clunk of metal finding metal was, in that silence, loud enough to stop a heart. A sentry on the dock above moved. Footsteps. A pause. Then footsteps continuing. Moving away, Lion held the mine in place against the hull with both hands, feeling the steel vibrate with the distant rumble of the ship's generator, and counted silently until he was certain the sentry was gone. Then he set the fuse. Then he paddled to the next ship. Crilly's team worked the southern section of the harbour, moving between vessels with the practiced efficiency of men who had rehearsed this exact procedure in the dark, in a swimming pool in Australia, until they could do it blind and silent and fast. The mines went on one after another, each placement taking between 90 seconds and 3 minutes, depending on the surface, condition of the hull and the behaviour of the sentries above. Between ships, the canoes sat motionless in the shadows, listening, calculating, mapping the patrol patterns with the quiet, methodical patience of men who had learned in training that patience was not a virtue in this context. It was a survival mechanism. Davidson's team hit 3 ships in the outer anchorage, vessels riding at anchor away from the main docks with minimal sentry presence, large freighters, fat with cargo, their waterlines sitting deep in the harbour water under the weight of supplies, destined for Japanese forward positions across the Pacific. Each mine went on clean. Each fuse was set. Each canoe moved on. By 3 a.m., all 6 canoes had cleared the inner harbour and were moving south through the anchorage approaches, heading for the outer islands and the rendezvous. Behind them, 7 ships sat in the dark water of Singapore Harbour, completely unaware that the countdown had already started. The first explosion happened at dawn. A deep, concussive thump that rolled across the harbour and vibrated the hulls of every ship within half a kilometre. Then another. Then a third, this one accompanied by a column of fire that climbed 50 metres into the morning sky and turned the harbour orange. By mid-morning, the Japanese naval authorities at Singapore were trying to process the impossible fact that ships in their most heavily defended port had been destroyed from below, from the inside, with no evidence of aircraft, no evidence of submarine, no evidence of any attack at all. 7 ships, 37,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping, 1 tanker carrying aviation fuel for the Imperial Japanese Air Force, 3 freighters laden with supplies for forward combat positions, 2 cargo vessels whose manifests were lost when they went to the bottom of Keppel Harbour, and 1 smaller vessel whose destruction was, in the calculus of the entire war, a footnote, but in the calculus of 14 men who had paddled 4,000 kilometres for the right to attach a magnet to its hull, the entire point. The Krite was at the rendezvous. All 6 canoes made it back. All 14 men were alive. The vessel turned south and began the long voyage home, moving away from the burning harbour at the pace of a tired fishing boat while, far behind them, Singapore Harbour was still trying to understand what had happened inside its walls. They were home in Exmouth Gulf on the 19th of October, 47 days after they had left. All 14 of them. Not a single man lost. The irony of Operation Jaywick is that it was kept so secret, so successfully buried in classification and official silence, that the men who conducted it spent decades unable to tell anyone what they had done. Lyon and Davidson planned a second mission, Operation Jaywick, that went catastrophically wrong in 1944, ending in capture and execution of most of the team. Lyon himself was killed in action. Davidson was captured and beheaded. The men who had paddled into the most fortified harbour on Earth and come home unscathed did not survive the war they had so brilliantly disrupted, and the men who had survived to tell the story were bound by official secrecy from telling it for years afterward. The Japanese never formally admitted what had been done to them. The official imperial record classified the harbour explosions as an accident, a technical failure of onboard munitions, because the alternative, the truth, was too humiliating to enter into the record, that the home port of the Japanese Pacific Fleet, surrounded by 40,000 soldiers and patrolled by the full resources of the Imperial Navy, had been successfully attacked by 14 men in a fishing boat and 6 canvas canoes. The most powerful military force in the Pacific had been embarrassed by the ocean equivalent of a bad joke. And the punchline was that the Australians had already been home for weeks before the Japanese finished counting the wrecks. The crate is still afloat. She sits in the Australian National Maritime Museum in Darling Harbour, Sydney, restored and preserved, and open to visitors who can walk her deck and stand in the space, where 14 men lived for 47 days and did something that the map said was impossible. She smells of diesel and old timber, and the particular kind of history that does not announce itself. She's 60 feet long, and she holds more of what Australia actually is than most monuments 10 times her size. And somewhere at the bottom of Keppel Harbour, deep in the silt and the dark water of a port that has been rebuilt and expanded and modernised beyond all recognition since 1943, there are pieces of steel that went down in fire on a September morning when the Japanese Empire looked into the darkness at its own docks and could not find the thing that had just destroyed it, because the thing had already gone home. Because 14 men in canvas canoes had decided that the map was wrong, and they had proven it, with magnets, in the dark, with a cup of tea waiting at the end. The greatest empires in history have always underestimated the men who fix their own fences, sail their own seas, and carry their own explosives, because those men do not fight for the map. They fight for the bloke in the next canoe. And the map has never won an argument with that.